All right. So have you ever like walked into a meeting and you just felt totally off? Like the energy is just all wrong. Everyone's on edge. And you just get that feeling
Yeah.
that like your ideas are just going to get shot down before you even open your mouth, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've all been there, right? Like that time I volunteered to lead my kid's soccer team. And I had all these grand plans, for drills and teamwork and all that stuff. But the kids were bickering.
Hmm.
And the parents were like second guessing every move I made. It felt more like herding cats than coaching. Turns out, as the town about, there's a whole science behind why some teams thrive while others just don't. And a lot of it boils down to this idea of a circle of safety, something Simon Sinek breaks down in his book, Leaders Eat Last. And it's actually pretty fascinating. He argues that our brains are still wired for survival, like our caveman ancestors facing down saber-toothed tigers, right? We're constantly on the lookout for threats. And when we feel unsafe, boom, our bodies go into fight or flight mode. Now imagine bringing that primal fear into the workplace.
I mean, you're not exactly going to be your most creative or collaborative self, right? But here's the cool part. Sinek says that great leaders, they can actually create a sense of safety within their teams. It's like building a wall around them, protecting them from external threats and those internal anxieties. And you know what happens within that circle? That's where the magic happens, right? Trust flourishes, ideas flow freely, and people feel empowered to take risks. He even compares it to packs of wolves, where the alpha, the leader, puts the well-being of the pack above their own. They're literally eating last to make sure everyone else is taken care of. And it makes sense, right? I mean, if you know your leader has your back, you're going to be more willing to put yourself out there, innovate, and really contribute to the team. But here's the thing. Creating a circle of safety in today's world is trickier than ever, right? I mean, we're just bombarded with information, deadlines, and this constant pressure to perform. It's so easy to lose sight of the human element in all of that. And Sinek talks about this idea of abstraction.
Like how technology and these big organizations can create distance between us. I mean, think about it. We're interacting with screens more than we are with actual people these days. And it's so easy to forget that there's a real person on the other end of that email or Zoom call. Remember that soccer team I was talking about? Oh, it took me a while. But I finally realized that my super intense coaching style wasn't really creating a safe space for the kids. So I dialed it back, started focusing more on building relationships and celebrating small wins. And you know what? The kids started having fun again. The parents chilled out. And we actually even started winning some games. Turns out, creating that circle of safety, it wasn't about me barking orders and trying to control everything. It was about making everyone feel seen, heard, and valued, which is pretty much the same thing Sinek is talking about in the book, just on a much larger scale, right? So the question is, how do we translate this into the workplace? How do we as leaders or even just team members start building those circles of safety? Well, that's where things get really interesting. And that's what we're going to dive into next. Okay, so we've been talking about this whole circle of safety thing, right? This idea that when people feel safe and supported, they can do amazing things. But how does that actually work in the real world? What does it look like when you put it into practice? Well, Sinek dives into, brain chemistry, and this is where it gets really interesting. He explains how hormones like dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and even cortisol, they all play a huge role in how we behave at work. You know what I mean? Like dopamine, that rush you get when you close a deal or you nail a presentation. It's super motivating, right? But too much emphasis on dopamine, on those individual rewards, it can actually create a culture of like competition and anxiety. Suddenly, it's everyone for themselves. And that sense of teamwork goes right out the window. It's like, remember that time I tried to bake a cake for my niece's birthday? I got so focused on making it perfect, like I was trying to win the Best On award or something. Yeah. And I totally forgot to involve my nephews in the process. They ended up feeling all left out. And honestly, the cake kind of flopped because I was so stressed and rushing. The whole thing was a bit of a disaster. And looking back, I realized I was so focused on my own dopamine hit that I messed up the whole team effort. And that's what Sinek is getting at, We need to be aware of the chemical signals we're sending out. It shouldn't just be about individual rewards. It's about creating that sense of shared success, that feeling of we're all in this together, which guess what is where oxytocin comes in, that warm and fuzzy hormone we get from connection and belonging. When leaders prioritize oxytocin, when they make an effort to foster trust and collaboration, it actually lowers cortisol, that stress hormone that makes us feel all anxious and burnt out. It's like creating a buffer against all those everyday pressures so people can think clearly and do their best work. And this isn't just some feel-good theory. Sinek actually backs it up with some pretty compelling examples. He talks about companies like Barry Wehmiller. It's a manufacturing company that refused to lay off workers during the recession. The CEO, Bob Chapman, he decided they would all share the burden. He asked everyone to take a few weeks of unpaid leave instead. It was a risky move, but it sent a really powerful message. He was showing the employees that they were valued, that the company had their backs. And you know what? Barry Wehmiller, they didn't just survive, they actually thrived. Talk about a real-life example of leaders eat last. But it's not always about these big gestures. It's also about those everyday actions that build trust and connection. Like just taking a minute to get to know your colleagues, asking about their weekends, celebrating their wins, offering to help when they seem overwhelmed. These small acts of kindness, they can go a long way in creating that feeling of safety, that sense that you're not just another cog in the machine, but a valued member of the team. And that brings me back to Sinek's point about abstraction. In a world where we're increasingly connected through technology, it's so easy to lose sight of the human element. We get so caught up in emails, deadlines, and metrics, and we forget that behind all those data points are real people with feelings, hopes, and dreams. Sinek uses this really chilling example, the Milgram experiment. You know the one, right? Where people were told to administer electric shocks to someone else. And most of them actually did it, just because a person in a position of authority told them to. It's a scary reminder of how easy it is to lose touch with our empathy, especially when we're not face to face with the consequences of our actions. And that's happening all the time in the workplace, isn't it? We're making decisions that impact people's lives, but we're not seeing them in person. So it's easier to compartmentalize, to justify tough choices based on the numbers. But Sinek argues that this kind of thinking, it's a slippery slope that leads to a culture of fear, mistrust, and eventually the whole thing just becomes dysfunctional. He even points to companies like Citigroup, where that kind of cutthroat culture actually contributed to the 2008 financial crisis. It's a pretty sobering reminder that putting profits ahead of people can have devastating consequences, not just for individual companies, but for everyone. So what's the alternative? Well, Sinek highlights companies like Costco and W.L. Gore and Associates. These are organizations that have built their success on a foundation of trust and employee well-being. They invest in their people, offer fair wages and benefits, and create a culture where everyone feels like they have a stake in the game. And you know what? It's not just good for morale, it's good for business too. These companies are consistently profitable, they've got loyal customers, and they attract and keep top talent. It's proof that putting people first isn't just the right thing to do, it's also a smart business strategy. But again, it's not always about these huge sweeping changes. It's about those small, everyday actions that build trust and connection. Taking the time to get to know your colleagues, asking about their weekend, celebrating their wins, offering a helping hand when they're feeling swamped. Those little acts of kindness can really go a long way in creating that feeling of safety, that sense that you're not just a cog in the machine, you're a valued part of the team. And that, my friends, is where the real magic happens. When people feel safe, respected, and valued, they're able to bring their best to work. They can innovate, collaborate, and really thrive. They're more likely to go the extra mile, to speak up with new ideas, and to have each other's backs through thick and thin. It's like, remember that time I was struggling with a project at work? I was totally freaking out. My teammate, she could have just ignored me, focused on her own stuff. But instead, she took the time to listen, offered some advice, and even helped me brainstorm solutions. It made a huge difference, not just for the project, but for how I felt about being at work. And that's the power of the circle of safety. It's not just about productivity. It's about creating a work environment where people feel supported, encouraged, and inspired to bring their best selves to the table. So how do we create these circles of safety in our own lives? Are there specific things we can do? Well, that's what we're going to explore next. Get ready to take some notes because this is where the rubber meets the road. Okay, so we've covered the why, right? We get why it's so important to create a circle of safety if we want to build strong teams and just, make work a better experience overall. But now the big question is how? How do we actually do it? How do we cultivate that sense of safety, trust, and belonging in our workplaces? Well, in Leaders Eat Last, Sinek lays out some really practical strategies, and I got to say, they really resonated with me. It's not about making these huge, sweeping changes. It's more about those consistent small actions that really add up over time. One of the things he emphasizes is the power of being vulnerable. Like leaders who are willing to admit they made a mistake, to ask for help, basically, just showing they're human too. It's like, remember that time I totally bombed the presentation at work? I was mortified. I just wanted to disappear. But my boss, instead of, yelling at me or making me feel even worse, he actually pulled me aside and was like, hey, I've been there. We all make mistakes. What can we learn from this? And it totally changed things. Instead of feeling like a complete failure, I felt supported. And honestly, it made me want to work even harder so I could prove I could do better next time. That's the impact of a leader who's not afraid to be vulnerable. It creates a space where it's okay to take risks, to mess up sometimes, and to learn and grow from it. And you know what else? Speaking of growth, Sinek talks about how important it is to have a purpose.
Like a shared mission.
Yeah.
That goes beyond just making money or hitting those quarterly targets. Because when people feel like their work has meaning, like they're part of something bigger, it sparks this whole other level of passion and commitment. It reminds me of when I was coaching that soccer team. Remember, once we shifted the focus from just winning to things like teamwork and having fun, everything changed. The kids were more into it, the parents were more supportive, and we even started playing better as a team. It was like by tapping into that shared purpose, we unleashed all this potential that was just waiting to be unlocked. And I think the same goes for the workplace too. When people connect with a mission that really resonates with them, they're more likely to put in the extra effort to support each other and to just really thrive. And here's something else that's pretty mind-blowing. Sinek says we need to be aware of how scale can affect things, like how the size and structure of our organizations can impact our ability to build trust and connect with each other. He brings up this concept called Dunbar's number, which basically says that we, as humans, can only really maintain around 150 meaningful relationships. Pretty crazy, huh? And it makes you think about how we designed our teams and companies. Like, maybe smaller, closer-knit groups are actually better at fostering collaboration and innovation. He even points to companies like W.L. Gore and Associates, the folks who make Gore-Tex. They have this really unique structure where teams are self-managed and they intentionally keep them small, under 200 people. And guess what? They've been super successful, both in terms of innovation and employee satisfaction. So what does all this mean for us? What can we take away from all of this? Well, I think it's a call to action. It's a reminder to be more intentional about the kind of work environment we're creating. Whether you're the CEO or an intern, you have the power to influence the culture around you. It starts with simple things, being kind, showing appreciation, actually listening to people, and offering support when they need it. It's about remembering that we're all human. We've got our strengths and weaknesses, and we're simply better together than we are alone. So, if you're a leader, think about how you can build that circle of safety within your team. Can you be more open and vulnerable? Can you share a little bit more about yourself? Can you foster that sense of shared purpose? And even if you're not a leader, think about how you can contribute to a more positive and supportive environment.
Could you offer to help a teammate who's struggling? Can you speak up if you see something that's not right? Can you just, be a kinder, more compassionate person? Because ultimately, it's those little acts of humanity, of connection, that can really make a world of difference. And here's the really cool part, you know. Creating a circle of safety, it doesn't just benefit our work lives, it actually has a ripple effect on society as a whole. When we build a world where people feel safe, respected, and valued, it spreads outward. It creates a world that's more just, more compassionate, and maybe even, dare I say, more loving. So let's ditch that whole cutthroat, every man for himself mentality. Let's embrace the idea of leaders eat last, and let's start building those circles of safety, one connection, one conversation, one act of kindness at a time, because who knows? Maybe that's how we can truly change the world.